Great, we're at the top of the hour, so let's go ahead and get started. Thank you everyone for joining us today and welcome to the Aurora Institute webinar, Mere Engagement, Reflections on the Connections Between Online Learning, Student Agency, and Student Engagement. During this time of COVID, we are happy to have so many great people coming together. Thank you for being with us today. My name is Susan Patrick. I'm the president and CEO for the Aurora Institute, and I'll be facilitating today's session. Next slide, please. Before we get started, please use the chat and introduce yourselves, share who you are, your role in organization, and where you're joining us from. Please use the chat to ask questions. Please know there'll be a series of reflection questions throughout the webinar, and we hope these will be prompts for you to respond in the chat. We'll also leave time at the end for our panelists to answer questions. We hope that you will be willing to share your learning on Twitter and social media at Aurora_INST period for Aurora Institute. We are recording and archiving today's webinar, and the slides and video will be available on our website, aurorainstitute.org. So thank you. Next slide, please. And now I'd like to introduce the topic, mere engagement. Next slide, please. Today's speakers are Laureen Avery, the director of the UCLA Center X Northeast Region Office. She focuses her work on supporting classroom teachers working with English learners through the Excel Leadership Academy. Marcia Jones was formerly the Associate Superintendent for Curriculum and Instruction with the Springdale Public Schools and is presently an adjunct professor at the University of Arkansas. Sarah Marl is a TESOL teacher and Excel coach at the Shelton Public Schools. Derek Wenmuth, until recently, was a director of Core Education, a not-for-profit education research and development organization in New Zealand. He's now working independently as an education consultant. So thank you. This is a worldwide audience, and thank you for joining us across the United States, across the globe, joining us on what is February 9th here, February 10th in New Zealand. And without further ado, I will turn it over to Derek to get us started. Thanks, Derek.
Tēnā koutou katoa, ngā mihi nui kia koutou. Thank you, Susan, for that introduction. And what a privilege it is to be a part of this and have had the opportunity to work with my three colleagues on piecing together this paper. The COVID experience has certainly been interesting times, and it's provided us a lot of opportunity to pause and reflect on our role as educators in this world. Can we move on to the next slide, please? And the next one. Thank you. So I guess what we have in mind when we were putting this paper together and for today's webinar is particularly in relation to the paper, is that it was an intent to capture the moment, what was happening in our lives as educators through COVID, and to reflect on those experiences, to engage in conversations, and on the basis of that, to design for the future. And in a way, that's what today's webinar hopefully will ignite for us, is to bring our experiences and through conversations some sense of what the future might hold and how we might prepare for it. We move to the next slide, please. I'm not going to try and go through every part of what's on this slide because, as Susan said, you'll get it. But part of my role here in New Zealand recently has been to gather together an analysis of reports that have been coming in from all over the world in relation to what happened during the COVID experience. And so the bullet points on the screen here just highlight some of the things which are consistent themes through those reports. And you'll see there things that will be no surprise to many of you, I'm sure, and things that are certainly signaled in the paper that Sarah and Marcia and Lorraine and I have pieced together. And you'll see that there's a common kind of emphasis there a lot about the nature and location and context of the learners, which is certainly signaled as we work through the things that have been learned, not just in New Zealand or America, but in fact in other jurisdictions as well. Move on to the next slide. And I just want to highlight, though, that through that, whilst we've had those high-level learnings, there's also this kind of tale of two cities that's emerged, that the experience for many was not so not such a good experience, not so positive. Many people found that social isolation really exposed for them the extent to which they were detached digitally from the rest of the world, or that their needs were not being met just in terms of the very basics, in terms of warmth, shelter, food, those sorts of things. And so many learners found that during this experience, they became increasingly isolated, increasingly distant, increasingly kind of left out of the learning experience for whatever reason, but there were gaps and there were barriers. On the other side of the coin, however, there are reports coming out, and we see a lot of this being written about now, saying, look, this has just drawn back the curtain on a whole lot of things about our education system that perhaps we hadn't looked at or considered in the past, but it's created new opportunities, a new richness, a new level of opportunity to connect with our learners and with each other. And so it's important, as we're considering the conversations that we'll have in the webinar today, that we understand that there is this dichotomy here, that it's not one size fits all or one experience for all. And through that, we have the opportunity to navigate a pathway that does design a future for everyone. So we move to the next slide, please. In our report, there were three big ideas that were distilled as we considered the experiences of the four of us and the reading that we'd done at that date. And they're on the screen at the moment. The first was acknowledging fears and building trust. And I think I saw evidence of this in my own experience here in New Zealand, where we had possibly the same as you'll have experienced in the States, but we had at one end of the spectrum, school leaders and educators who became really concerned that their primary role was to deliver curriculum. And so their response was just to make sure that they were delivering stuff for kids to do. And at the other end of the spectrum, people whose primary concern was around the well-being and the health and the concern and care for students and their families in their context. And it was that second part that really exposed the opportunities to build new learning partnerships, new learning relationships here. And so acknowledging fears and building trust, we found was really an important part of what we're talking about. The next one that came out here was establishing distance learning relationships. And we've all become quite expert now in using Zoom or Microsoft Teams or whatever device we want to use. But to understand that there are new skills, new ways of working that we need to learn when we're establishing relationships at a distance using these new technologies. And that doesn't necessarily just happen overnight. But the important thing is that we are working consciously to exploit those things to see those relationships built. And then the third one really is something that's very dear to my heart, and I know the hearts of the others, my other co-authors, is the concept of student agency. And the raw meaning of agency for me is that you have choices and you are able to act on those choices. And in the context of learners, when you separate them from the physical location, the buildings that they attend every day as a school, and they're working at home with the resources available to them and their context and the support available to them, we have to understand them as learners quite differently to what we may have done in classrooms, where we've kind of implicitly almost often take more control and more ownership of the learning, and understand what it means to shift that ownership to them through the design, the learning design that we make. So those are our three big points. Let's just look at them in the next few slides in a little more detail, please. Next slide. So that first thing about building trust, acknowledging fears and building trust, there was a little meme that was going around Twitter that I liked a lot. It was emphasizing Maslow over Bloom. The idea that actually that concern about the context and the well-being of our students, to move them to the point where they were feeling more empowered and in control and confident about what they were doing, over the focus on delivering stuff and making sure that they had things to do and were covering the content. And that means that we have to create more time in the virtual space for conversation. And that was, in many of the educators I've spoken with, it was a challenge for them in the first place, where they realized that in their attempt to make sure that students had work to do and were covering the curriculum, they were overwhelming them with way more than they could ever fit into the time in the day that they had to study. And that actually it was relationships that were more important. It was the conversations that that were going to really break through. Now, we've posted here some reflective questions on each of these slides, and I invite you to consider these for two reasons. One is, you might see a prompt here for something that you want to comment about in the chat, and we will certainly be addressing those points that you raise through the webinar. But really, the main reason for putting these questions there is that we would really love for you to be able to use these as you go away from the webinar and use them in your context and with the colleagues that you interact with, to ponder further what it is going to look like as we move down the track post-COVID, or still in that situation, to design a truly agentic, learner-focused system into the future. So we have the next slide. We'll just pick up a little more, please, on this idea of establishing distance learning relationships. And a big thing here that's written about in our paper is developing a really good understanding about the roles, relationships, and responsibilities. In New Zealand, I've had a number of conversations with educators who went through that process and kind of almost without necessarily thinking too deeply about it, made assumptions that, for instance, students' parents would be on hand to help them with the work that they were sending out for them to do. But actually, until we understand the context much more deeply and understand that actually, in one case, parents may not be there because they're essential workers. So how do you build relationships of support through the network? Or in other cases, parents who feel less than adequate to actually assist in some of the subject areas and some of the learning content that their children are dealing with. And there are many other factors beside. But building those relationships means that, first and foremost, we actually have to get to know our students and their context, which means we have to get to know those who are in their context supporting them, and then building that up from there. So the idea of a learner profile becomes really significant here. And so in our questions there, we invite you, you may already be doing those sorts of things. You may have some examples that you want to share with others, because in doing so, you can enrich the community who are a part of this webinar and beyond to move forward. And to the next slide, please. And as I say, this is a big topic that probably is worth several webinars on its own. But really, this is the focus of the paper, the title of which is Mere Engagement. And it's that idea of, we cannot underestimate the understanding that we have about what we mean by engagement. Engagement doesn't just mean turning up and being able to sign the role. It doesn't mean just having our picture on the Zoom session to say that I was there. It doesn't just mean completing a task on time and sending it back. There are multiple levels at which we need to understand engagement, and engagement as a result of agentic activity. And so the opportunity that we've had through the COVID experience to understand what can happen when we give our students more personal freedoms and responsibilities, and increase the sense of ownership they have about their learning into self-management, self-directedness. These sorts of things became very, very clear and evident. And for some teachers we spoke to and who reported back, it was a surprise the extent to which their learners were able to step up and take that responsibility. So our challenge is, how can we design learning in ways that actually amplify those things? And what are the implications then for eventually, when we do have opportunity to come back face to face, for what we should do in those contexts? So look, I'm going to hand it over now to my colleagues to take it the next step, and we'll be looking forward to your conversation in the chat. Kia ora.
On. There you go. We got to remember to turn ourselves on. Thanks, Susan. This is Marcia, and Sarah and I are going to spend the next few minutes of our webinar kind of drilling down from those three big ideas. And as the paper presents, we have listed these in this particular presentation in kind of a grouped way, so that as we think about solutions and observations, that we know these things overlap and interject with one another. And so that's what we're kind of thinking about today to make this smoothly flow, and that we'll think about making the implicit explicit, the anytime, anyplace learning, and keeping families in the loop as kind of a big collective of ideas. And I also see that we've got folks on our chat that have had a lot of experience, and yet we also, in our experience, had people that were thrown into distance learning. So when you are seeing the ideas and the solutions, those of you with lots of experience, lots of preparation can really be a great help to those who maybe have just been thrust into it due to circumstance. So we're valuing everybody's experience here for certain. Let's go on to the next slide then. So when we're talking about making the implicit explicit, that is letting us understand that people on the other end, the families in our loop, the idea that we are going to have synchronous and asynchronous observations of time. These things have to be at the top of the teacher's list. You don't see those nuances of someone being confused, particularly if it's in an asynchronous environment, or you're not accustomed, we haven't been accustomed perhaps to recognizing that this really is a family affair. And so as we think about really drilling down to say we're going to have to give more conversations in writing, for example, I think that's a phrase that Derek uses, that we need to make sure that the whole family understands what the accountability is to the work, and at a minimum, make sure that the guardian or parent or someone that is potentially available, a mentor of some sort, is available to help the student if there is confusion, particularly in those asynchronous times. So how do we ensure that we've got the exact communication structures in play in multiple ways? Not just singularly, you're not just being able to necessarily write it up on the whiteboard and leave it for review all day. There's got to be those permanent efforts to say a child can recoup the information, a parent can find it, the guardian or the mentor can find it in order to help the student move forward. So as we've been thinking about the implicit, explicit conversations, we want to know, what can we do to make things more explicit, particularly when our outcomes of performance did not meet our expectations of performance? And have we discovered tools in this experience to clarify what students need to know and be able to do? And then do we have tools that have been found to be successful with student agency as we want kids to increase their depth of engagement? So those are the reflection questions that might be helpful. Next slide, please. As I've referenced, when we're in this new learning environment of virtual learning, and we are not, someone asked the question, I'm going to try to address it. When we're talking about virtual learning, it could be a Zoom online environment. It could be uploaded lessons that a student does independently. I think the definition of virtual, it has tremendous breadth of definition. And that's the first thing that as a team you're going to want to explore is, what are we talking about when we're talking about virtual learning? So please know that in my experience, there's been a variety of ways in which this virtual environment has come forward. Rini, Derek, do you want to tag into that? Because I want to make sure we're clear that this is a broad-based conversation, not a narrow one.
Yeah, we had the same discussion when we were organizing this, because we started using the terms virtual learning, distance learning, asynchronous learning. And like I said in the chat, I keep hearing about opening schools up again as though, nothing has happened for 12 months. And the thought, we come to competency-based learning and some of the other sort of key points, picking up, like Scott said in the chat, being outdoors and doing something outside the school. That I think that we mean virtual learning in the broadest possible sense. And maybe what we really mean is not in a traditional classroom. So.
Yeah. And in the chat, someone just brought up, do you mean independent learning? And yes, as the various forms. And Rini, can you go back one slide, please? And we're going to push to Sarah here in just a sec. But as we're thinking about the broad definition of experience, that's part of the problem. We have not put language to a strict definition. And so people were just kind of making it up as they went. And what is it that we need to really clarify when we're talking about virtual learning? Because our parents were sometimes caught off guard. They might have thought that it was going to be a Zoom where the teacher was walking through 2 or 3 hours a day with their student, where in reality it was reclaiming material on a line that the student was to work on independently. And so having that partnership, going back to that keeping families in the loop, that anytime, any place learning concept, I think what has added to the confusion that it hasn't been well defined. So in light of this conversation, systems for synchronous and asynchronous meeting times, how well has that gone? What could have been better? And how have the students been responding? I think we're seeing that there are problems with agency, the student accepting that responsibility for that independent learning opportunity, and even attending to particularly younger children. My daughter is a teacher of in the primary school, and she would have her reading lessons online. And meanwhile, back at the ranch, her first graders were under the table while she was trying to have a reading lesson. And mom is even sitting there beside the child, but not controlling the child. So we've got to say what's worked with our kids and how has it not worked. And have you considered how your learner profile impact is in place? What do you know about what the child is facing trying to meet the issues of the day, as we're having either a synchronous or an asynchronous environment? I just had the opportunity to have my grandchildren's puppy at my home the other day, and he was such a distraction to me while I was trying to go to Zoom. I can imagine that same scenario coming over and over in households where the animals and the TV and the telephone and the noise of other things are interfering. So how are we setting up conditions, and what help does a child have to set up conditions for that anytime, any place learning? Sarah's going to share some of examples of some of the things she has found to work to help us keep our implicit more explicit as we do anytime, any place learning. So Sarah, hello.
Hi, thank you, Marcia. So I'm just going to start by going back to what Marcia was saying about the differing levels of experience that we all have at this. I came into distance learning in spring of 2020, like many people did, with no experience in it, being thrown into it from the pandemic. So I wanted to share some examples of my journey in distance learning and what I have done that has worked to make the learning, the implicit, explicit with my students. I'm an English as a second language teacher. And so I'm always thinking in the frame of language learning and trying to make things as explicit for my learners as possible. And in our district, when we went into distance learning, we all became language learners in the language of distance learning. So I tried to be as explicit as possible on Google Classroom. And these are some examples from last year in my 3rd grade Google Classroom. And I would post things in writing, but then I would also have videos for directions, videos for mini lessons. I included as many graphic organizers, and you'll see the tiny little picture. There's a rubric there for them to help them guide their writing, because our work was a writing assignment at this point. It's also important to note at this time, our district was not really doing synchronous learning. Everything was really asynchronous. We could only have students one-on-one synchronously. So everything had to be really clear for students on Google Classroom, because they were actually really mostly responsible for their learning at this point. Next slide, please. So things have changed since the spring. We've all kind of developed some new tricks. Things have changed within our district, where we are doing a lot of synchronous learning when we're on distance learning. And Rini just put a link in the chat for everyone. I'm going to be talking about my weekly slide deck that I use, and that's from slidesmania.com. They have great templates. So now I do post my assignments still on Google Classroom. I post them weekly, and students have their time to spend throughout the week with what works for them in their schedule on my assignments. We also have a Google Meet schedule that they follow. And in my weekly slide deck, I have the schedule for every day for them for the Google Meets. I include the target, and again, I have graphic organizers, I have the link to their assignment, and I have videos with directions. The one thing that I've really liked about doing things this way is I can also include audio, so they can listen to their learning target instead of just having to read things and just look at a video. They also have audio they can listen to. So I try to tackle things from all sides. Next slide.
Okay, so the third piece of this kind of collective of the tenets of making the implicit explicit anytime, any place learning is almost something that's so obvious, but keeping families in the loop. We have had to adjust that it's not simply a matter of having that traditional teacher parent or teacher child relationship, and then on occasion you engage the parent or the guardian or the mentor, however it works for the child. But now we're having to say that we've got to have a strong partnership, a strong understanding with parent about what the differences are between sending your child to school in a traditional way versus what is happening in an online environment. So we've asked ourselves, what's working to get parents to buy into this concept? Some parents have been very resistant. We've had pushback to say, that's not my job. I don't understand this. This isn't what I signed up for. And yet during the pandemic, there had to be an establishment of a relationship with parents to say, but this is what we need to do right now. Let's figure out how to make this work. And how have you been able to communicate? As was mentioned earlier, sometimes parents are in and out of the home as they're working or having to care for other children. They can't give the individual child the attachments they need for learning, and even just access to resources. And we'll talk about that more, but your learner profile data will also help understand, does the child have access to their own computer, to an iPad, to an iPhone? I teach students online at the university level, and I'll often observe the fact that my students are on a phone, which makes seeing the screen a lot smaller and a lot more difficult to read the fine print. But that is the resource that they have in their under-resourced areas. So that's what they're using. So what are we finding are examples of what connectivity our kids have, and what do we need to do to strengthen how we communicate with them? And so hopefully they're emerging some really great examples of creative ways in which we can get used to getting parents connected. So with that, Sarah, I'll turn it back to you.
Okay, next slide, please. So here are some tools that I've been using throughout distance learning to stay in touch with my families. I know that Talking Points is a popular tool that a lot of people use, but I wanted to highlight it because it has really changed my communication with families. I am, like I said, an ESL teacher, so my communication with families is not typically that daily communication that classroom teachers have. But since distance learning has started, by using talking points to text message families and have the text messages translated for them, has increased my communication significantly with them. I'd like to think it's like 75 to 80% of my families that I'm communicating with on a regular basis. So like weekly to every other week. Some families I talk to almost daily on talking points. So it really has been a game changer for me. And I also like to say all the time, whenever I talk about distance learning, yes, it's difficult. Yes, it's hard to stay in touch with people, but talking points and distance learning has actually, it's been the best thing to come out of distance learning for me, my communication with families using this. Next slide, please. So that's talking points is more for my daily regular communication with families. But I've been using Wakelet for my more lengthy communications that I need to send out. And Wakelet is great because it also translates the information that you put in there. So it has an immersive reader function with a number of languages, tons of them, that they can translate the information to and read it. They can also listen to it. So I had to send out information at the beginning of this year because I've been working completely distance learning, even though my district is back in person. I had a medical issue that kept me home this year. So I needed to explain that to families, and I needed them to know things to remember about having Google Meets, because this was a whole new thing for us this year. We hadn't done Google Meets prior to this year. I put a reminder in about how to join a Google Classroom and just all the information that they needed to know to feel comfortable with what their children were going to be doing as a part of their education this year. I also, on every communication that's lengthy like this that I send through Wakelet, I include a video about how to translate the page. So that's going back to making things explicit for people. I walk them through the exact buttons on how to translate it, just so they remember, since they're not exposed to Wakelet on a regular basis. Next slide, please. And then this was just more of an example of what was included in there. I put my Google Meet schedule in just so that they would have it and they would be able to translate it. I put a little reminder of when the students' work would be posted. And then I also included a video of things that students need to remember about being on Google Meet, so that their parents could see what was expected of them when they would be on their Google Meets. So just basically how to use the tools and things like that for the parents. Next slide.
Sarah, I want to tag just a minute. I think you've made such an important point. Rini, go back one slide, because Sarah made such an important point. How do we help the parents know how to use these tools? And I think that is so critical, that we make assumptions that everyone will be able to intuitively understand these tools. And so, Sarah, thank you for really making that a focus of your work. I think that's great. Appreciate that. Okay, Rini, next slide, please. All right, well, the next three elements that we've kind of lumped together for thinking is a competency-based learning, which is clearly not something that is virtual learning involvement, but it takes on a little bit different flavor, perhaps, in virtual learning, as does most every traditional way we think about our education structures. We want to think about how we want to link interest to environment. Oftentimes we have to ensure that we know what the environment allows for a student to have access to, and what we're wanting students to do in the way of science experiments, let's say, for example, but also how can we make lessons environmentally sensitive and friendly. And then obviously, again, nothing new for educators, but this whole notion of checking for understanding, checking for learning is a part of the whole framework of how do we know if our kids are doing what we want them to do to the level they need to be proficient. So how do we understand our checking for understanding and learning? So, okay, go to the next one then, please. The great thing about distance learning, and I think Derek talked about that in his positive takeaways, is that we really can move away from a seat time model. And those of us who have been advocates for giving the students the information they need to proceed at their own pace so they're not bogged down with repetition when they don't need it, but have the time they need when they do need it, so that they understand how do you get from point A to point Z and what are the steps to get there. We love that because we think that this is what our new environment for a distance learning model really affords us. And we really also then need to take advantage of that environment of online to push that agenda of giving multiple ways to exhibit learning. This is a great opportunity, I think, for us to really push the agenda of what we've tried to do in a traditional setting, but it's been somewhat hampered because it's hard to get out of the old mindset of what does it mean to demonstrate what you've learned? What does it mean to either lockstep how a kid learns or give them the whole enchilada and let them work on it all together? We've had a hard time sometimes breaking away from tradition in that area. The other thing has to be flexibility. And that's, again, a baseline for competency-based education, this whole concept that we can be flexible. We can give students different pathways to achieving the same end. I had shared when we were thinking about our planning that there were times when I, online with my university students, found myself having to be very flexible. The doorbell would ring, so someone would have to go answer. A little child, a baby needed his bottle, and a mother would be bringing the child on their lap to feed the child because dad hadn't gotten home yet. Those things did never offend me. What they did was say, you're willing to do whatever it takes to get this work done. I, on the other hand, need to be flexible. So I think our question is, and this is something Sarah has shared with her district's perhaps shift, is what it was the freedom that our teachers were given to be more flexible, to have more opportunity to take advantage of this new environment instead of being stuck in the old framework. And are the students actually being given that implicit, explicit information so that they know what it means to be proficient in their learning outcomes? Okay, next slide, please. When we're talking about linking to the environment, I said this a little bit earlier, how can we be environmentally friendly, certainly culturally friendly and sensitive in our assignments? Those things are not unknown, of course, in a traditional environment, but now with a virtual environment, it takes on an even more important element, as we know that the family itself is going to be all collected around this environment for learning just by virtue of where they live and how they live. And so what can we do? What are some examples of how we've created some environmentally friendly and more culturally sensitive assignments? Good thinking for the traditional classroom, in my opinion, essential for an environment shift into a virtual classroom. What have we done as educators to design lessons where our interests and the access to material resources that are in the home or in the neighborhood can bring a richness and a different kind of depth of learning that perhaps is limited, again, if we're in the confines of the school house? And then how can we design learning tasks that can be applied to any environment? We can't ask a child to take a certain type of material and use it in a specific way unless we can guarantee that they have it. So one of the things that I know Sarah's worked on a lot is making sure that her assignments are environmentally broad so that it can apply in any way. So with that said, Sarah, I'll turn it back to you to share.
Hi, sorry about that. Talk about being flexible. I had a little 3-year-old trying to get in the room.
Yeah, I apologize. I'm going to do the last one here because I forgot. So,
Okay.
yeah, the unrehearsed here. We're going to also be fitting in this checking for learning. How do we know what our kids have learned? Now, when you're doing your traditional classroom, you can walk around, but then when you have no control over what is actually taking part in real time in terms of how students are doing their work, what have we learned about formative feedback that can be successful in online? And how can we be creative to engage our parents and the peers of the students, maybe older brothers or sisters or grandparents, to get involved in helping provide that feedback? So what are we doing to make sure that we are tracking how our kids are learning? A challenge for us in this virtual environment. So Sarah, now, sorry.
Okay, so these are just a couple of quick examples about things that we've actually done in my building this year. The first example is from a book called Island Born. We were doing this actually as a school-wide assignment. So students listened to a read aloud of it, and then they were asked to think about the main character's culture and then think about their own family culture, their heritage, where their family comes from, and if there were any similarities to the main character's culture. So students were prompted to share, and that was just bringing in the cultural piece. So then on the bottom, the lab report rubric, this is an example of actually being flexible with the home environment, but then also letting students have a guide for their expectations. So we in second grade have to teach students how to write the conclusion for a lab report. So that necessitates doing a science experiment. And we were in full distance learning at the point in our writing unit that this came up. So the second grade teacher and I worked to plan a sink and float experiment. And we did that because we didn't want students and families to have to worry about acquiring anything. We're in the middle of a pandemic. People aren't going to the store as often. And, we needed to be sensitive about what they would actually have in their homes. So for our sink and float experiment, the teacher modeled using one item from her home and then said to her students, okay, find something that you can put in water, gave some guidelines, and then let them choose their own item to practice the sink and float experiment with. So that's, considering the home environment and things that are available there for them. And the rubric that we use, we do this for every writing unit. We put expectations on the left-hand side that students need to remember, and we introduce it at the beginning of our writing unit, and we have it available for them every day during writing. And on the right-hand side, there are either sentence starters or sentence frames to help guide them in their writing. They're told they can use those sentence starters or sentence frames, or they are welcome to come up with their own. And so these are just examples, again, of the home environment and culture, and then also making sure students have expectations that they can work off of. Next slide.
Thank you, Sarah. I love your examples. And again, that sensitivity to making sure that every child has a chance. And that, of course, leads us into the last big idea, which is to ensure equitable opportunities. And I've seen some chat as we've gone along where that is really at the heart of the educators trying to balance out. We've got this virtual experience now, but we acknowledge that there are students who did not benefit in the way they could and should have simply because of a lack of access. So Rini, next slide, please. So as we think about online learning, that we recognize in this case, and the definition of equity that we're focusing in on for this particular article has to do with the access to devices, the quality of devices, and even reliable internet. As we were preparing, some of us were sharing the fact that, you know what, my internet's been a little dicey today. The weather's changing. We're having a system move in that sometimes interferes with what we can get on our computers. So when we're talking about the notion of equity here, and again, there's lots of depth to equity, but in this narrow frame, we're thinking about it in terms of how do we make sure that students have the devices, quality devices, and reliable internet. And what have we learned? How can we get information back about the interferences that our kids are having, and what other partnerships do we need to create with our internet providers, or our having the capacity to check out material goods such as a computer or a printer to a student. So those equity conversations are really outside the realm of us doing the very best work we can to provide the very best learning environments. But quite frankly, without addressing this, virtual learning can't move forward, because we can't give anything down the pipeline if the pipeline doesn't exist. So that's where we are with our concern for and needing to collect data about the equity issues having to do with access to materials such as computers, printers, even a fax machine, whatever it takes. Okay, with that said, I think, Rini, we're turning it back over to you now for some Q&A.
So thank you, everyone. And if you're not following the chat, there's a very rich discussion going on there too. But I just want to pull out a couple of points. And the first is the last one that just came up. Jacob asked about parental involvement, and if there's a difference in, working with younger children and older children among the ages. So Sarah, I'm wondering if you could speak to that, and if there's anyone in the audience who works with older students and has some experience that they'd like to share with that also. But Sarah, why don't we start with you?
Sure. Again, my experience is limited to elementary school. However, I do know that the other ESL teachers in my department, including those in grades 5 through 12, use talking points all the time with their parents and have a lot of success with it. What makes it really great is that it's a text message, and so it just goes right to their phone rather than sending emails or making phone calls. I just feel like it's what everybody's used to with communication these days. So it seems to be just the fastest way to communicate with parents for us, and the most effective, honestly.
And if anyone has anything to add, I think you could just unmute yourself and hop in.
Rini, while some are thinking about that, this is Marcia. I think that working with older students, sometimes it needs to be kind of a family council kind of approach. When is it that the student is going to be online? Who else needs to be online? It's almost a scheduling kind of conversation. And again, in some households, that's maybe a lot easier said than done. But the student, no matter age, young or old, in my observation, should not rely solely on their own resources to have to solve problems. It is a community of people living under the same roof, whatever that means. And so there has to be a kind of a community conversation around, it's my time to be online, or it's my need to use the computer, the one that we're sharing. I need quiet, and I can't have the radio blaring in the background, whatever it is. I think there is absolutely a need to have family engagement, regardless of how old the person is, young or teenage, either way.
I can jump in here too. This is Susan, and we did a webinar last fall with Elizabeth Stock from Power My Learning, and she's constantly got a regular feedback loop with elementary, middle, and high school students. And their parents too. And it was really interesting because the parents were asking about on the schedules, if there was a way to have the older students really have a block schedule in the afternoon when they're all remote, and the younger students have a block schedule A in the morning, and then the older students could help facilitate for the younger students and sort of and give more time to even like over the course of a district to be able to make some of those schedules in partnership with input from teachers and the family on how that might be structured. I don't know if you saw this piece that just came out yesterday in the US, but it was saying that the number of teachers that had been consulted for how the schedules and how the remote learning might work, we really need to involve all of our stakeholders much more on thinking through new designs, whether it's for COVID or fundamental, our educators and students and families can be involved in the reimagining of what education looks like going forward post-COVID too.
Thanks, everyone. And there's some thoughts and ideas coming up in the chat also. I want to pose a question that's emerging out of the thread in the chat all along, and maybe Derek, Marcia, and Sarah would like each of you to address this because you come at this from different points. But there's something about it's perhaps student agency, student ownership, student ability to navigate this new world and whatever it looks like, and whether the students who have a handle on that virtually are the same kids who have a handle on it in traditional school. So there's a lot of equity issues there, and how this is evolving and changing. I mean, we've been doing this for a year now, almost a year, and certainly lots and lots of things have changed. So Derek, why don't we start with you?
Yeah, kia ora, Lorraine. I think that's a good prompt, and I guess one of the thoughts going through my mind as you were speaking, out of my experience anyway, certainly in New Zealand, is or two things really. I dropped into the chat a concept that we have in New Zealand called tuakana taina. It's a Maori term, which is actually thinking beyond just that relationship between teacher learner, but actually everyone involved, right? So, and that's specifically about the older one looking after the younger and how knowledge is passed on. So that's just one point I wanted to make in relation to that. But I think the other, which comes out of this, is pertinent to your point, is that I think for many people who have jumped into or been forced to jump into the online environment as a new thing, one of the behaviors we've seen in many educators is the sort of thing that we've seen over time. We say, oh, this is new to us, so we have to master it. We have to understand it to make it work for our learners, right? And so immediately we do that, we start putting constraints and conditions around what that environment will be and how it will work and so forth, right? The very worst example I saw of that was a school that I was involved or had a connection with, where the staff were required to set out a 6-hour timetable for their students to be online synchronously for 6 hours a day, changing every hour, and that the staff had to be in their suit and tie, and the women the same, and the students had to be in their uniform at the other end. Right? Now that kind of demonstrates a mindset that's quite different to mine anyway, but it shows how we often fall victim to appropriating these new environments and new technology and feeling like we have to be in charge. And I think the point you made, Lorraine, is that this is an opportunity really for us all to consider ourselves as learners and to understand that actually in the midst there are learners, students, there are people who have been doing some of this for some time and who've got very successful strategies for maintaining relationships and communicating and sharing resources and building new ideas that perhaps have been invisible to us, but somehow need to become brought to the fore in the way that we work. Now, it's easy for me to say that. It's not an easy thing to act on. It challenges our own presuppositions and dispositions and prejudices. But it's the strong feeling I have, if we're sincere about the concept of mere engagement and pursuing student agency, we really need to open things up a little. Enough from me.
Thanks. Sarah, you wanna?
So thinking about the differences that I see in students when they're full distance learning versus in school, you know, we do have some students who are really flourishing as distance learners, I think. They really like being at home with their family. They really like being on the computer. And I think that they like the flexibility of it a little bit too in their day. There's a little bit more time for breaks when you're at home. You can kind of get up and walk around for a few minutes rather than feeling the constraints of having your seat in your classroom. We do have some that struggle with distance learning, and communication is difficult, and just any type of engagement with it is difficult for them. But we are kind of going in and out of distance learning as a district, and those students are often the ones that they're in school when the school building is open. And, you know, I think it's tough because we want the best for all of our students all at the same time. But what I think the good thing is that we're providing them the option to be distance learners if that's what their preference is at this time. So I think that's helped students to be successful wherever they are, at least a little bit.
Thanks, Sarah. So Marcia, I'm going to give you the last minute to wrap up. But I do want to say that the big question is what we go forward with. You know, what do we want to take with us into the future? And of course, we don't have any time to talk about that right now. But I think it is the single underlying current here. So I'm going to give you the last word, Marcia. You have to unmute, Marcia.
I've been turning it on and off. I think we absolutely need to touch base with our students. We need to find out what's been working, what hasn't been working, what were your barriers to making this make sense for you. We need to engage our parents to find out what can we do differently or better than we have been. And if you've got something that's really been working, celebrate that and share that and make sure that others in our field know that. I love the way Derek put it. He said, you know, we have to master it. Well, we're trying to master something that we don't know what it even could look like. And our customers are our students. They can tell us and help us frame the future. So my hope is that we can reach out to our students and have them help us design this future instead of trying to think it's all one-sided as we have been so inclined to do our lives. So.
Okay, thank you. And I'm going to turn things back to Susan.
Thank you, and thank you all. What an amazing example of collaboration from so many different experts in seeing different things, and shows you the importance of our relationships, both personal and professional, in so generously pulling this together. It really does challenge us to think about how we shift our instruction, our structures, and our culture, and knowing that online and blended learning are just delivery models, but really important ones right now. Really important ones. Thinking through how we can better personalize that learning per person, per individual, per learner, and to focus really on competency-based structures along the way. So would love for you to provide us some feedback. Thank you for joining us today, everyone. We love to get feedback and appreciate you taking a look at this link It's a 1-minute survey that helps us shape our webinars and work. Please note this webinar session is recorded and will be available. Next slide, please. We hope you will join us for our upcoming webinars. Go on our website and follow our social channels. And last slide, please. Thank you again for being here. We hope to stay connected to you. Please let us know what we can do to support your work. And we look forward to seeing everybody again soon. Take care. Be well. Bye-bye.